The Colosseum, the giant stone stadium where Romans cheered as people got sliced and diced, was somehow built in just 8 years without any cranes, and somehow it didn't collapse like a badly built IKEA shelf. But this architectural marvel did not just appear out of nowhere. It was built on top of a whole mess of Roman drama and a city that had recently been torched like someone left the oven on and forgot about it. Back in the older times, Rome went up in flames when a massive fire tore through the city and left half of it in ashes. And while people were still digging through the rubble, Emperor Nero decided this was the perfect spot to build himself a fancy new palace, the Domus Aurea. Imagine your neighbor's house burning down, and the guy across the street builds a gold-covered mansion on the wreckage, complete with a lake and gardens. Yeah, not exactly a PR masterclass. So when the unpopular ruler finally got the boot, his replacement knew he had to fix things fast. His plan was to fill in Nero's man-made lake and replace it with something huge, something that would win back the people's favor. And his idea was the Colosseum, a massive arena where the public could cheer, drink, and watch gladiators duke it out like ancient WWE, except with lions. Construction started a few years later, and somehow, with no cranes or power tools, they managed to finish this absolute beast of a structure in just 8 years. That is faster than some medieval cathedrals took to build their front door. Of course, building something this massive was not exactly cheap, and the Romans did not reach for their wallets. Instead, they went full pirate mode and paid for it the old-fashioned way, by stealing someone else's treasure. After crushing the siege of Jerusalem, the Romans looted the Jewish temple and walked away with piles of gold, silver, and valuables that were enough to fund the entire Colosseum project. Because why raise taxes when you can just rob someone instead? But funding was just one part of the equation. They also needed an insane amount of manpower. That is where an estimated 60,000 to 100,000 Jewish slaves came in. Their story starts far from Rome, in a city that had been turned into a battlefield. After crushing a rebellion, Roman soldiers stormed through the streets, dragging survivors from their homes. Their entire families were torn apart and marched hundreds of miles back to Rome. Once there, these exhausted, poor souls found themselves at the heart of an enormous construction project, one that didn't care if they were starving. They were forced to drag massive blocks of limestone, each one heavier than a car. They mixed endless piles of concrete, their hands raw from hours of shoveling and pouring. And when they weren't wrestling with stone and mortar, they worked the scaffolding of climbing dangerously high wooden frames without harnesses, all while carrying loads that could crush them if they slipped. Meanwhile, the precision work, which included the arches, the seating layers, and the underground maze, was left to skilled Roman engineers and craftsmen. These guys were masters of their craft. The Romans had perfected concrete, and their version of the stuff was durable, fast-drying, and even able to set underwater. Honestly, it is no surprise parts of the Colosseum are still standing while some modern buildings can barely survive a thunderstorm. But even with solid foundations and durable materials, the Colosseum was not going to build itself. The Romans had to pull off some serious logistical magic to keep things moving, and that meant turning the site into what was basically an ancient construction assembly line. First came the foundations, and the Romans did not mess around. They laid down massive, concrete, donut-shaped foundations beneath the outer walls and arena ellipse. This clever design acted like a giant stabilizer, preventing the whole structure from shifting or sinking even on the soft, marshy ground that used to be Nero's lake. And since building on top of a former pond was not exactly ideal, they dug 26-foot drainage channels to funnel out water from the area. Basically, they turned the site into a giant stone bathtub, just without the rubber duckies. Now for the materials, and this is where Roman engineering really showed off. They used the travertine limestone for the framework. It is strong, durable, and heavy enough to keep the whole thing grounded. Secondly, they used the volcanic tuff for the upper levels. It is lightweight but fire resistant, so the upper layers don't crush the lower ones. And of course, Roman concrete, the MVP of ancient building materials. This stuff dried fast, bonded like glue, and could even harden underwater. Seriously, Roman concrete had more staying power than some Hollywood marriages. On top of that, they added brick-faced concrete, tiles, and wood for smaller structures. The whole thing was held together with iron clamps, which the Romans locked in place by pouring molten lead over them. No fancy welding gear required. But hauling those materials to the site was a whole challenge on its own. The travertine blocks, some weighing over 5 tons, had to be dragged from Tivoli, about 20 miles away. With no flatbed trucks in sight, Romans relied on ox carts, wooden sleds, and, well, a whole lot of grunting and cursing. Honestly, this was not a smooth delivery. This was try not to die under a giant rock halfway there. Now, the real key to keeping the whole operation running like clockwork was organization. The Romans didn't just pile up materials in random heaps, they set up staging zones, so workers always had supplies within arm's reach. Slaves handled the brutal grunt work from sunrise to sunset. Meanwhile, skilled engineers oversaw the more delicate tasks like carving perfect archways, designing stair systems, and managing the whole chaotic mess like a wedding planner on their 5th espresso. The Colosseum was strong, yep, but more than that, it was smartly designed. The Romans did not just want a massive stone fortress, they wanted an arena that could handle tens of thousands of rowdy spectators without turning into total chaos. And they nailed it. For starters, the Colosseum's shape was not random. Instead of a typical circle or rectangle, they went with an elliptical design that stretched about 189 meters long, 156 meters wide, and stood at an impressive 48 meters high. The oval shape was a game changer for visibility. No nosebleed seats with a great view of someone's shoulder instead of the arena floor. But the real genius was not just in the shape, it was in the structure. The Colosseum's outer walls were supported by a system of 80 massive arches evenly spaced and stacked across 3 levels. These were crucial to the building's strength. With the evenly distributed weight across the structure, the arches allowed the Colosseum to stand strong without relying on solid walls, which would have been far heavier and more prone to collapse. Instead of forcing spectators to squeeze through a handful of narrow entry points, the Romans used these 80 arches as designated entrances. Each arch was numbered, which meant spectators could easily find their assigned entrance and get to their seats faster. With this system, the Colosseum could fill or empty its massive crowd of 50,000 to 80,000 people in minutes. Basically, the Romans had figured out crowd control long before your local stadiums did, and they did not even have to hire security staff in neon vests. Inside, the Romans had even more clever tricks up their sleeves. The Colosseum's vaulted corridors were one of its most underrated design features. These stone passageways curved overhead, creating tunnels that directed foot traffic like express lanes. They allowed people to move quickly throughout the arena without creating bottlenecks, no awkward shuffling behind someone who suddenly forgot how to walk. Seating inside the Colosseum followed a strict social order, and the Romans took this hierarchy seriously. The best seats in the house belonged to the elite, such as senators, magistrates, and other VIPs who lounged in the front rows on polished marble seats and were treated like royalty. The wealthy merchant class claimed the next few rows, seated on sturdy travertine benches. Meanwhile, commoners were crammed into the higher tiers with limited space and uncomfortable seating. If you were stuck up there, you were probably wedged between someone's elbow and another person's knee. And then there were the very top seats reserved for women, the poor, and anyone else who couldn't bribe their way closer to the action. Those folks were packed in like sardines, because even in ancient Rome, the cheap seats were still the worst seats in the house. But the most impressive part of the Colosseum was not above ground at all, it was hidden beneath the arena. The Hypogeum. It was added later by Emperor Domitian. Hypogeum was an underground labyrinth of tunnels, cages, and holding cells. This was where gladiators, wild animals, and elaborate stage props were kept before their dramatic entrance into the arena. It was like a backstage dressing room, except instead of makeup and mirrors, there were restless lions pacing around and guys nervously sharpening swords. The Hypogeum was an engineering marvel in itself. The Romans built a complex network of pathways that allowed workers to move animals and props into position without the crowd above knowing what was happening. There were trapdoors in the arena floor that could suddenly open, creating the illusion that animals or fighters had appeared out of nowhere. Some platforms were operated by pulley systems, allowing workers to raise beasts like bears, lions, or even entire stage props right onto the battlefield. It was less like a theater and more like a magic show. One moment the floor was empty, and the next a lion was lunging at a terrified gladiator. Roman engineers had invented the jump scare long before horror movies existed. The Hypogeum also had multiple hidden entry points that allowed gladiators to emerge from unexpected angles, adding an extra layer of drama. There's even evidence that they had elaborate stage mechanics like platforms that could rise, descend, or even rotate to surprise the audience. In some cases, props like fake trees, rocks, or entire miniature battle sets could be lifted into the arena to create elaborate scenes. But perhaps the most impressive part of the Hypogeum's design was how well it blended practicality with showmanship. Gladiators could be guided to their entry points without the audience knowing who was about to emerge. Animals were usually kept caged underground for hours, sometimes even days, before suddenly being released into the arena in a carefully choreographed moment. The entire thing was designed to keep the audience on edge, never knowing what was coming next. The Colosseum's design was about creating an experience. The Romans knew that if they were going to keep tens of thousands of people entertained for hours, they had to go big. So they designed a structure that was a machine built to thrill, shock, and leave people walking away with something to talk about. And judging by the fact that we are still talking about it nearly 2,000 years later, I would say they nailed it. With everything finished, it was time to break the place in, and the Romans weren't about to throw some quiet ribbon-cutting ceremony. Nope, they went all out. In 80 AD, Emperor Titus hosted the Inaugural Games, a brutal, over-the-top spectacle that lasted a whopping 100 days. During that time, the Colosseum became an absolute bloodbath, packed with gladiator battles, wild animal hunts, and even mock naval battles where they flooded the arena floor and staged full-on war scenes. Because apparently, watching someone get eaten up by a lion was not quite dramatic enough on its own. Managing the crowd for an event this big sounds like a logistical nightmare, but once again, the Romans had it figured out. Thanks to those 80 arched entrances, the arena could empty out in just minutes. No chaotic stampedes, no "where is my sandal" moments. They even numbered the entrances. But like most great things, the Colosseum's glory days did not last forever. After centuries of roaring crowds, clashing swords, and lions wondering why their dinner kept fighting back, the arena's purpose started to shift, and not in a good way. By 438 AD, the once iconic gladiator games came to an end. It was not some noble decision to stop the violence. The empire was crumbling, resources were running thin, and frankly, keeping a stadium full of lions, criminals, and angry dudes with swords was not exactly cost-effective anymore. From there, the Colosseum entered what can only be described as its weird phase. During the medieval era, the once great arena became, well, a bit of everything. Parts of it were turned into a cemetery. Some areas became makeshift workshops. And believe it or not, people even moved in. Yes, Actual families were living inside the Colosseum like it was some twisted medieval apartment complex. But if that was not bad enough, Mother Nature decided to take a few swings at it too. In 1349, a massive earthquake rocked Rome, bringing down nearly 2/3 of the Colosseum's outer wall. And if you are wondering why no one rushed to fix it, well, they didn't. Instead, locals started treating the fallen stonework like an ancient Home Depot. Over the centuries, builders swiped Colosseum stones for everything from churches to palaces, and even pried out the iron clamps that once held the structure together. Basically, Rome's most iconic monument spent a good chunk of history being looted like it was on clearance. By the time the dust settled, the Colosseum was a battered shadow of its former self, but somehow it refused to disappear. Fast forward to the 19th century, and the Colosseum finally caught a break. Restoration efforts kicked off to stabilize what was left by reinforcing walls, repairing crumbling arches, and finally putting a stop to people showing up with chisels. But the real push to preserve the Colosseum did not kick into high gear until modern times. Ongoing restoration projects continue to this day, with experts constantly patching up weathered stones, reinforcing weakened sections, and working tirelessly to make sure this ancient giant doesn't turn into a pile of rubble. And despite all the chaos it has endured, the Colosseum has still managed to become one of the most iconic landmarks in the world. It now welcomes over 7 million visitors annually, standing proud as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and one of the new 7 wonders of the world. Not bad for a building that spent half its life being treated like a medieval scrapyard. But while the Colosseum may look like a weathered skeleton of its former self, it still holds echoes of the past, whispers of roaring crowds, and the undeniable mark of Rome's engineering brilliance. Because if there is one thing the Colosseum proves, it is that even after centuries of disaster, decay, and questionable renovation ideas, some things are built to last. 8 years. That is all it took to create one of the most iconic structures in history, and no, it was not just luck or brute force that made it possible. The Romans pulled it off thanks to a combination of smart planning, massive manpower, and some serious engineering genius. If you are curious about more incredible feats from the past, hit that subscribe button. Catch you in the next one.